So what I want to do is I want to say a few words about PRISM, maybe introduce a few people and then introduce the speaker. So the idea behind PRISM is it's a program targeted for first, second-year students here at Northeastern to give you an opportunity to explore and discover activities and results in science and mathematics. So it's an out of the classroom, typically think of it as out of the traditional classroom kind of experience. And I've handed out a flyer that gives you more detail on that. So I won't go into the detail, but I would like to point out some of the people in the audience who are critical and to the success of the PRISM program in your experience, and that you will have the opportunity to work with at other points throughout this year. So one is Professor Sherman in the mathematics department, Professor Chris King, also in the mathematics department, who works on quantum information theory and networks and all kinds of interesting things. Sometimes he'll do cryptography if you ask him nicely. Professor Dagmar Sternad, who's in biology, physics, and electrical and computer engineering. And she has an absolutely fantastic lab on motion. And so one of the things that PRISM students get the opportunity to experience is going in and doing experiments in the lab. But then you have to write it up and say what you learned. And perhaps you even have to design the experiment. Let me just mention, so these I think are really great opportunities. They don't cost any money. It costs your time and your investment, but I think it's well worthwhile the opportunity to work with other students, which is part of what goes on in PRISM. We have a very strong cadre of mentors that are a big part of the experience. Luella, I see here, is Emily here. Hello, Emily. Any others?
Julie.
Anyone else? So they're the sort of heartbeat of the program. They keep things going. Let me just mention very briefly 2 more events we have planned for the fall. One is we'll have another presentation, 2 more presentations. One will be by undergraduate students talking about their undergraduate research experience here at Northeastern, particularly with a focus on what was the path that you followed from arriving here on campus as an incoming first-year student and getting involved in undergraduate research. How did that happen for you? And there'll be a number of students, and that I think will be really interesting. Another event is that J. Murray Gibson, the Dean of the College of Science, will also be talking. We'll be giving a presentation later this semester. So right now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Lisa Feldman Barrett is a distinguished professor of psychology. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Waterloo. And she came to Northeastern maybe about the same time as some of you, or pretty close, 2010. In addition to her being a distinguished professor in psychology, she's also a research fellow at the Harvard Medical School and a research neuroscientist at Mass General Hospital. So please join me in welcoming Professor Barrett.
So first, I just want to thank everyone who's part of the PRISM program for having me come and talk to you today. And I always like to start my my talks by thanking my laboratory. Here you see some of my lab. I have 20 full-time people in my lab, postdocs, undergraduate students, and full-time research assistants, and this semester 56 undergraduates who work in the lab. So we have a pretty big shop. Undergraduates are the, I would say, the heartbeat of the laboratory. Undergraduates in our lab help us design experiments, run the experiments, analyze the experiments, sometimes even write them up for publication. Our lab has a long history of training undergraduates in science, and when I was your age, actually, I worked in 2 laboratories when I was an undergraduate student, which diverted me from medical school and sent me on my way to becoming a research scientist. And in addition, I'd like to also just acknowledge some collaborators. So the work I'm going to be presenting today was really done as a group, a large group of people who contributed to this work. Today, what I want to talk to you about is emotion. I'm going to talk to you about the science of emotion, and I'm going to use the science of emotion to show you how you can integrate scientific approaches from a number of different research domains. So the research domains I'm going to be talking about today are cognitive neuroscience, which is the study of the brain in living and breathing humans and other animals, social psychology, and a little bit of visual neuroscience. And I want to start with introducing you to an idea that you're probably all deeply familiar with. And this is an idea that really pervades our cultural ideas about emotion, and really it's a key feature in the Western civilization view of the mind. And that is that emotions are like little bombs that go off in the subcortical parts of your brain. So deep within your brain, we have these subcortical regions that control basic functions. And the idea is that emotion, is triggered by something in the world, a stimulus. One of these little bombs goes off, and then it takes over whatever you were thinking or doing a moment beforehand, and often leads you to act in some unfortunate way. Anybody who's ever been angry probably is familiar with this idea. And the idea is that emotion is separate from cognition, that is the parts of the brain that regulate your emotion at the front of the brain, and perceptual regions that are at the back of the brain. So these special subcortical circuits that separate emotion and cognition from perception. This tripartite view of the mind can be found in really almost every single theoretical perspective in psychology and neuroscience on the mind. And really, in philosophical circles, sometimes this is talked about as a stagecoach model, where the horses are like the wild beasts that you have to contain as the rider. Sometimes, people use an elephant and a rider metaphor. There's this big, massive elephant that kind of wants to do what it wants to do, and then you're left trying to, regulate after the fact. The problem with this idea, which has been around for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years, is that it actually doesn't match our understanding of brain evolution. So this kind of a model that emotions are triggered automatically and then they get regulated after the fact is kind of based on what evolutionary biologists call a triune brain concept. And that's the idea that in evolution, reptiles evolved these parts of deep subcortical parts of the brain that were involved in perception, in perceiving something in the world and reacting to it automatically. So frogs have these detectors, that let them detect like little black moving things in the environment, and then when they do, they just kind of react and stick their tongue out and try to eat it. And then through evolution, as the reptiles, evolved into mammals, that there were new evolutionary mechanisms for emotion that evolved that are specific adaptations for the mammalian brain. And then human evolution really added on cognition after the fact. So first perception evolved, then emotion evolved, then cognition evolved. That's the kind of idea that has really underlay a lot of of work on emotion and related topics for the last 150 years or so. The thing is that we already know from brain evolution that the cortex doesn't really sit on top of the rest of the brain like icing on an already baked cake. In fact, what we know is that the one thing that is really important that happens throughout the course of human evolution, actually the evolution of the primate brain, not just the human brain, is that as brains grow and size and they get more sophisticated, they reorganize. So George Strider, who is a scientist who studies brain evolution, thinks about the brain like a company. As companies grow, they acquire new functions, they have to reorganize. And that's really what happens throughout brain evolution. And so what this means is that throughout the course of primate evolution, it's not really the case that new faculties of the mind, like emotion and cognition, were added on after the fact. Instead, what you see is a real change in connectivity. So the one thing that marks a human brain, well, there are many things, but a really important thing that marks a human brain as separate from, say, a chimpanzee brain, is that it has tremendous connectivity. That brain regions are connected to each other that in the chimpanzee, you don't really find. And for us, some of our most important, when it comes to emotion, some of our most important connections have to do with regions of the prefrontal cortex that we're going to talk a little bit about today, and that project right down into the subcortex and into your spinal column, right onto the nuclei which control basic body functions. So what this means, and these connections are monosynaptic, which means there's one axon between cells in the cortex and cells in subcortical regions. So what this means for humans is that we have much better cortical oversight of our the subcortical regions that are important for behaviors like freezing and fleeing and fighting and the behaviors that we think of as being really important to adapting to the world. Another important thing about these connections is that they're not inhibitory. So normally we think about emotion as something which is pulled from us from the environment, and then we kind of clamp down on it after the fact, try to regulate it after the fact with our prodigious cortical regions. But it turns out that a lot of these cortical regions actually have excitatory, not just inhibitory connections. So that's important because it means that oftentimes the cortex can be involved in triggering those behaviors like fleeing and fighting and all the emotional behaviors that we kind of think about. And another important thing, and this is the thing that I kind of want to draw your attention to today, is that the timing when these cortical regions are brought online really makes it unlikely that this idea of the subcortical regions of emotion are acting by themselves. So if I present you with a visual stimulus like a face or a scene that has some, actually even that's a neutral face, but especially if it's an evocative face like somebody scowling at you, or a scene that has some kind of affective significance for you, within under 40 milliseconds, you have the cortical parts of your brain are already talking to the subcortical parts of your brain. So the idea that emotion lives in one part of the brain and cognition lives in another part of the brain just doesn't make sense from a timing perspective. What is the implication of this? The implication of this in science is that if you want to understand emotion, it's important to understand what subcortical regions are doing, but it's not sufficient. So it's important to understand how animals freeze and flee and fight in challenging situations, but it isn't sufficient for understanding. And that turns out to be I mean, to you, that might seem to be like, okay, well, that seems, but actually, in the science of emotion, that's an incredibly contentious thing to say. It's incredibly contentious and provocative thing to be arguing that cortical regions are important to emotion, but even more than that, that the brain might not respect categories like cognition and emotion and perception, right? To you and to me, a thought is very, very different from a feeling, which is very, very different from a perception of the world. But it's possible, given all of this connectivity that we see in the human brain, that those categories are subjective categories and are not respected by the brain. And if that's true, then it means that there's a big course correction that needs to happen in the field of psychology. And I'm going to show you now some data that I think really speak to the question of whether this is true. This is a human brain. It's a glass brain. And on this brain, you'll see dots. And the dots are peaks. They're points in the brain that are show an increase in activation during either the perception of emotion, which are yellow dots, and the red dots are the experience of emotion. So if we take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies, in fact, all the studies that have ever been published in neuroimaging studies of the brain, so those are fMRI studies or PET studies, studies of living, breathing humans as they engage in a perception of emotion or an experience of emotion, and we plot, well, what are the parts of the brain that are showing the most response to emotion? This is what we see. And you can see, first of all, that they're all over the place. They're not just in subcortical regions at the base of the brain. They look like they're everywhere. And we can use some statistical means to look and see whether this sort of swath of activation all over the place is actually correct, or whether this is just, the spread of these activations just have to do with chance. And when we do that, we should call them meta-analysis, meaning an analysis of many, many studies. This is what we see. So this is the human brain on emotion. And I'll just orient you to what this looks like in case you're not familiar. So this is a lateral view of the brain. This is the front, and that's the back. A lateral view would be if you just looked at the side of one of the hemispheres. This is what you would see. This is a medial view of the brain here. This is the front, that's the back. So if I were to take the two hemispheres and crack them open like an egg, and you were just to look inside at one half, that's what you would see. And what we've done here is pulled out the cerebellum, which is an important structure for movement, and subcortical regions, like the regions I'm referring to before, that in animal studies have been very important in producing emotional behaviors like freezing and fleeing and so on. And then this is a ventral view of the brain. This is the front, and this is the back. So if I were to take your brain and pop it up on its end and look at the undersurface of the brain, this is what you would see. And the colors just represent regions of the brain that are showing a consistent increase in activation that are not due to chance. So these are, the different colors reflect different levels of statistical significance. So you don't really need to pay attention to those. What you do need to pay attention to is the fact that if the idea that emotions were part of our animal past, they had nothing to do with being human, that all mammals, they only live in parts of the brain that all mammals have, then you would only actually see activations here, maybe here, but mostly here. But that's not what you see. What you see is something more consistent with what brain evolution tells us, and that is that there are many, many parts of the brain that seem to be consistently active during emotion. And another thing that's really interesting is that some of the regions that we see active are regions that typically are active during emotion. So for example, remember I mentioned there are parts of the brain that regulate these subcortical regions, just monosynaptically regulate them. Those are called paralimbic portions of the cortex. And they're regions like this, which is called lateral orbital frontal cortex. It's called orbital frontal because this is the orbital sector of the brain, orbital meaning over your eyes. And there are regions like here, medial, this is usually called medial orbital frontal cortex. This is a region that is known to have, this is where those direct projections are straight down into your subcortical regions. And there's also a region that's deep inside the frontal lobe, all the way at the back of the frontal lobe, called the insula. This is a really important region for sensing what your body is doing and experiencing it as a feeling. So, you know, sometimes when you have internal sensations from your body, you experience them as physical sensations, right? Like your stomach hurts, or you know, you're feeling nauseated, or I'm trying to think of a good one, but you know, something physical. Sometimes you experience those feelings from your body as just general affective feelings, like you feel wound up, or you feel tired, you feel energetic, you know, or you feel kind of dragged out. Sometimes those sensations from your body are experienced as emotion. That is, you're angry, your stomach churning is an index to you that you're angry, right? Or the fact that you're feeling warm is an index to you that you're feeling sad, or what have you. And sometimes those feelings are actually contributing to perceptions of the world. So sometimes your body, you experience your body as your reaction to the world. Like, I'm angry at Joe. But sometimes those sensations from your body, you experience them as telling you the way the world is. Like, Joe's an asshole, right? Or, you know, you might say, oh, I really like that drink. Or you might say, that drink is delicious. That person is really nice. That person is really mean. Your body's always involved in those kinds of perceptions. And so this is an area of the brain, the anterior insula in particular, that's active. So you see these regions that are important to emotion being active, but you also see regions that are important to perception being active at the back of the brain. And you also see regions that are important to mind perception, that is the ability for me to look at your face and infer something about your intentions or your thoughts. And you also see regions that are important to what is called executive function, which is your ability to choose to do one thing over another, or to inhibit you know, a pretty potent response, like if I put a piece of chocolate cake in front of you and you know, have to stop yourself. Maybe I'm just describing my own psychology, but you have to stop yourself from eating it. That's part of the brain's important. So more formally, what we would say is that in emotion, consistently, we see parts of the brain that are important, that everyone thought were important to emotion, but thought was important to emotion in a regulatory way. And here, there's no emotion regulation going on. These are not studies of emotion regulation. They're studies of emotional experience and emotion perception. And we also see brain regions that are important in cognition, to thoughts, and to attention. And we also see brain regions that are important to perception. What these findings, you know, suggest is that that the boundary at the biological level is blurred between cognition and emotion. In psychology, if any of you have taken psychology courses, or if you've looked at an intro psych textbook, oftentimes people will write that cognition and emotion interact to produce behavior. But cognition and emotion are not mechanisms, right? A thought or a feeling or a perception are mental states, and they don't map in a one-to-one way to different parts of the brain. The parts of those activations that I showed you are often, you see them active in other kinds of experiments, like experiments on attention, experiments on beliefs, experiments on object perception, and so on and so forth. And so really these data like these coming from neuroimaging experiments really lead us to kind of stop and think about our most basic models of the mind in psychology and wonder whether they need to be revised. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with neuroimaging, like functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, or PET imaging, here's what happens. Subjects, especially for fMRI, it's true for PET too, but more important for fMRI, subjects are put into, they lie down, they have to keep completely still. A coil is placed around their head, sometimes with a bite bar, sometimes not, but they're completely still. And then we show them, we're not really allowed to do anything terrible to them. That's just human subjects doesn't allow that anymore, so we're not allowed to do that. But so what do we do to evoke emotion? We show them pictures, or we get them to remember some emotional event, try to kind of recreate it. Like you know how it is when you're on a long drive and you sort of have a reverie, because that didn't ever happen to anybody, and you get yourself all worked up. Yeah, I see some smiles. So yeah, we all know this happens. And so people can do it, and they can do it pretty vividly. But here's the really neat thing. You've got subjects who are strapped on this bed, and they're completely still. And you might be asking yourself, well, is this even emotion? Like, are we even evoking emotion in these people? And but the answer is yes. We can actually go back to these subcortical regions that are important in animal studies of emotion, important to every time we freeze or run away or fight, or even approach for food or sex. And one really important region that's important in many, many, many animal studies is this brain region called the periaqueductal gray. And in animal studies, we know that there are columns of cells in the periaqueductal gray that are specifically important for flight and for fight and for calm, kind of tranquil responses. And what we can see is that these regions are consistently active in emotion. So why is this cool? This is cool because you have subjects can't flee, and they can't fight, and they can't, they really are still. But yet, brain regions that are important to physical action are active in the scanner. Let me give you another example. There's a brain region called the amygdala, which is important to emotion. But it's also important to face perception. Like if you just show a neutral face to people, you get activation in the amygdala. Where is the activation in the amygdala? You show a face, just a novel face. They've never seen that face before. You get activation in cortical regions, what are called the cortical nuclei of the amygdala. They're not actually cortical, well, I don't want to get into that. They're nuclei in the amygdala that are linked to olfaction. People aren't smelling anything, you're just showing them a face. But yet you get regions of the brain that are important to olfaction active. Now why would that happen? It happens because mammals, humans are very visual animals, but not all mammals are very visual mammals, right? Most mammals identify each other by scent. And so when you show a novel face to someone, and you get activation in these brain regions, even though they're not smelling anything. So fMRI it has its limitations. For example, given for example, we couldn't tell the difference between these different columns in the PAG using an fMRI method. It's just the measurement is too coarse for that. But still we can see that these people are, by any scientific definition, experiencing emotion or perceiving it in these experiments. So there's not really, the findings can't be dismissed on the basis that, this is not really emotion.